very warm welcome to a new episode of Melt. I'm Ritvika Gupta shooting from home. This week we are continuing our Z Melt 2021 series and revisiting a session today by Bob Hoffman, author and chief aggravation officer, Type A Group. Bob is the author of 5 Amazon best-selling books about advertising and is one of the most sought-after international speakers on advertising and marketing. In his talk titled Confessions of a Skeptic, Bob will narrate his experience in the advertising industry, the challenges that it faces, and what it can do to win back consumer trust. Let's get ready to melt with Bob Hoffman.
The theme of my talk today is Confessions of a Skeptic. I think skepticism can make you a better marketer. The first rule is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. Richard Feynman, one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century, said that. Feynman was a math and physics genius who won the Nobel Prize, but he was always worried that he would fool himself into thinking he understood things that he didn't really understand. I think Feynman's first rule is particularly relevant to us in the advertising and marketing industry. I think we're fooling ourselves. I think we believe we know things that we don't really know. The theme of this conference, History is Not Bunk, is particularly relevant to this in this regard, because the advertising and marketing industry respects no history. In most fields of endeavors, progress is achieved by the accretion of knowledge over time. Advertising is different. We respect no history. We observe no principles. We have no connective tissue. Every generation tosses out what was learned before and declares it dead. Marketing is dead. Television is dead. Advertising is dead. Every generation invents its own dreadful jargon that for a brief time passes for wisdom. In most disciplines, there are unifying principles. Some examples: physics has the law of conservation of energy. Biology has natural selection. Economics has supply and demand. These are fundamental to the nature of the discipline. In advertising, what are the unifying fundamental principles that we all accept? If there are any, I don't know what they are. A field of endeavor without principles is not a discipline. It's a free-for-all. I think we're living in a fantasy land. It's a fantasy land in which people want to join the conversation about our brands. It's a fantasy land in which people want to engage with our content. It's a fantasy land in which personalization has made advertising more appealing. It's a fantasy land in which consumers want to have relationships with brands, in which brands are loved by consumers. My personal involvement in the advertising industry has convinced me of exactly the opposite. It seems to me that most people are perfectly satisfied with having the shallowest of connections to us. They are quite satisfied just to buy our products from time to time and to focus their passions on their lives, not peanut butter or paper towels. Most marketers don't understand that while their brands are vitally important to them, they're of little consequence to their consumers. If your brand is not available, for the most part, your customers will be very happy to buy another. If you're a marketer and you believe people love your brand because they happen to buy it, I think you're kidding yourself. Most of what we call brand love is simply familiarity, convenience, mild satisfaction, or easy availability. Now, are some consumers strongly attached to a few brands? Sure we are. But remember, we each participate in hundreds of product categories and are strongly attached to maybe a handful of brands. I promise you, if Pepsi would disappear tomorrow, most Pepsi lovers would switch to Coke with very little psychological damage. There's an enormous difference between brand acceptability and brand love. Our deepest desire is to be loved, but most of our customers don't love us and never will. And sadly, spending time and money trying to convince them to love us is largely a waste of time. The reason most people buy most products is because they're cheaper, tastier, prettier, they work better, or are simply more familiar and more readily available. But in our contemporary fantasy land, we're not just agents of sales. We are brand architects and cultural anthropologists and relationship scientists. It seems that the worse we get at marketing, the more preposterous our job descriptions become. Let's have a look at your behavior and see how it correlates with the beliefs of our industry. Do you feel personally engaged with these brands? Do you join the conversation about any of this stuff? Do you share branded content about any of it? Do you ever co-create with any of these brands? Do you feel like you're part of these products' tribes or communities? If you don't, why in the world do you believe anyone else does? I believe a smart marketer assumes that no one gives a flying about her brand. She assumes that she has to prove its value to her customers every day of the year. She takes nothing for granted. She does not believe that there are hordes of brand ambassadors out there in cyberland advocating for her brand or having conversations about it, except maybe to complain. For a smart marketer, every day is Groundhog Day. Every day you have to get up, drag your to work, and remind the world once again why they should buy your stuff. That's why God created advertising. I've been around advertising a long time. I spent over 40 years in the agency business and another 7 or 8 writing about it. I don't know anything. I'm faking it. I always have been. I have no idea why anybody buys anything. I have no idea why you buy Coke instead of Pepsi or Nike instead of Adidas. As a matter of fact, I have no idea why I buy Coke instead of Pepsi. All I know is this. If your brand is famous, familiar, and comfortable, people are much more likely to buy it. And if you do a lot of mass advertising and it's good, you're a lot more likely to become famous, familiar, and comfortable. I think we pretend to know a whole lot of stuff that we don't really know. What we do mostly is precision guessing. We guess. We know what other companies have done. We understand their strategies and their methods. If it worked for others, we try something like it ourselves, and we hope that it's going to work for us. We have a fancy name for this. We call it best practices. But the problem is every company is different, every problem is different, every brand is different, and every circumstance is different. And what makes best practices in one instance may be a total disaster in another. Often what we do works a little because that's what marketing mostly does. Mostly it works a little. Every now and then something works amazingly well. And we don't know why, but we pretend it was because we're really smart. Sometimes we are. Sometimes we're lucky. There are so many variables in advertising and marketing, and our individual successes and failures provide such a small sample that it's hard for us to know what is the result of our acumen and what's the result of, I don't know, luck, circumstances, trends, randomness, stupidity on the part of our competitors, something else. I've had enough advertising successes and failures to know that I never knew what was going to be successful and what was going to flop. No matter how much I thought I knew, I never really knew. 10 years ago, we were treated to a glorious vision of the future for our industry. It was expected to be one of the most fruitful and productive decades in the history of advertising. We had amazing new tools and amazing new media that we never had before. The whole thing was intoxicating and certain to lead to all kinds of new opportunities. Our ability to personalize advertising and reach consumers one-to-one was sure to make advertising more relevant, more timely, and more likable. Our ability to listen to consumer conversations through social media and react quickly couldn't help but connect brands more closely with their customers. The opportunity for people to interact with media was certain to make advertising more engaging. And yet, by the near unanimous opinion of people inside and outside the ad business, the past decade has been awful. Advertising has gotten worse, not better. It has gotten less effective, not more. Rather than creating advertising that is more relevant, more timely, and more likable, we're creating advertising that's more annoying, more disliked, and more avoided. The work we're doing for brands is not terribly successful. A study by Nielsen recently reported that consumers say they are 46% more likely to change brands than they were just 5 years ago. And only 8% say they are strongly brand loyal. Regulators and governments are after us with a passion. They want to know what we're doing with data and whether we are acting illegally in collecting, trading, and selling personal private information about consumers. One study showed that of all forms of advertising, the 8 types most disliked by consumers were all forms of online advertising. As a result, ad blocking apps are reportedly present in somewhere between 1 and 2 billion devices. Tens of billions of dollars are being stolen annually by online ad fraud. Consumers are becoming disgusted with our practice of tracking them, collecting personal private information about them, and selling it to the highest bidder or any bidder at all. Under the circumstances, it's hard for me to take seriously the opinions of the marketing and advertising experts who led us down this path. I think anyone who is not skeptical of the current assumptions and direction of the marketing industry is out of touch with reality. Another of the deeply troubling aspects of our current situation is ad fraud. The scope of online ad fraud has been argued about for years. On one side, we have advertising and marketing trade associations, ad agencies, and their security consultants who tell us that ad fraud is a minor problem that is being well defended and, in fact, is shrinking annually. On the other side, we have independent researchers who tell us that ad fraud is a massive problem that has become harder to identify and is out of control and growing dangerously. One of the great promises of online advertising was that it would lead to more accountability because it would be more measurable. It has turned out to be more measurable, but the problem is we don't know what the hell we're measuring. The unreliability of the metrics we get and the torrent of fraud are so massive that accountability is faith, not fact. I want to tell you about an economist. His name's Dr. Roberto Cavazos. He's a professor of economics at the University of Baltimore here in the United States. Dr. Cavazos' specialty is business fraud. He has studied business fraud for over 30 years. In 2019, he participated in a study called The Economic Cost of Bad Actors on the Internet, Ad Fraud 2019. After the study, Professor Cavazos calculated that the direct cost of fraud in 2019 would be in the neighborhood of $23 billion, and the direct and indirect cost would be close to 30 billion. He stated, quote, I have studied the economic costs of fraud in many sectors for decades, and I was left stunned by the scale of fraud in online advertising, unquote. Another participant in the study was the digital advertising director of the Financial Times, Anthony Hitchings. When the study was released, Hitchings had this to say, quote, the scale of fraud we found is jaw-dropping. The industry continues to waste marketing budgets on what is essentially organized crime. For a good laugh, compare that to what the Association of National Advertisers here in the US has to say about ad fraud. In 2018, they issued a report entitled War on Ad Fraud is Succeeding, and their report claimed that fraud would fall by 40% to $5 billion in 2019. The feckless ANA and other advertising trade associations continue to cover their asses and mislead their members, the industry, and the public about the extent of criminal activity that is polluting online advertising and costing advertisers and marketers tens of billions of dollars. Last year, Professor Cavazos and his collaborators repeated their study of 2019, and they were shocked by what they found. Quote, the level of ad fraud is now staggering. The digital advertising sector has higher fraud rates than multi-trillion-dollar sectors. The report estimated that ad fraud increased by about 50% in 2020. That's a 50% increase in 1 year. A few months ago, a white paper released by Advertising Age and researchers Spider Labs estimated that ad fraud is stealing over $60 billion annually. Here's a specific example of how ad fraud affected one company. Kevin Frisch, the former head of performance marketing and CRM at Uber, tells the story of how ad fraud, specifically attribution fraud, was headed toward eating 100 million of Uber's $150 million online ad budget. Quote, we turned off 2/3 of our spend. We turned off 100 million of annual spend out of 150 and basically saw no change, unquote. The truth is, nobody knows the exact extent of ad fraud, but there's no doubt about one thing. Online ad fraud is enormous. According to the World Federation of Advertisers, by 2025, ad fraud may be the second largest source of criminal revenue in the world after drug trafficking. Fraud is found in every aspect of online advertising. Ellen Pao, former CEO of Reddit, says, quote, it's all true, everything is fake. Let's summarize. We've had a lost decade. We have allowed ourselves to be bamboozled by the suspect assertions of articulate people and more than a few clowns masquerading as advertising and marketing experts. We have lost any sense of history and placed our bets on a shiny new version of advertising and marketing that has been sold to us untried and untested. We have lost any healthy degree of skepticism, and it is costing marketers tens of billions of dollars every year. We would be wise to keep open minds and admit that a great deal of our understanding of consumer behavior is incomplete at best and incorrect at worst. We would do ourselves and our industry a whole lot of good by exercising a little modesty and a little discretion before we claim to know things we don't really know. My advice to you is, do not listen to loudmouths like me. Don't just accept the assertions of big shots. Don't rely on the cliches of our business. The only repository of facts is in the history of our industry. Everything else is speculation. If you want to be a better marketer, question everything and demand the facts or dig them out for yourself. Give yourself the wonderful freedom of skepticism. And remember, nobody is smarter than the facts. Thank you very much for listening.
Now let's get to the Q&A session where delegates at ZMelt got the opportunity to interact with the speakers after their presentations. Here's a snippet.
If we had a set of principles like most other disciplines have that said, here are the 5 things about advertising that we all agree on, That would make it a sensible discipline. But if there are 5 things that we all agree on, I don't know what they are. Right now, there's tremendous controversy on whether we're supposed to talk to people individually, one to one, or whether mass talking to people is better. We can't decide whether short-term or long-term advertising is more effective. There are so many fundamental questions about the nature of advertising that we don't agree on. Now, I think there's some pretty good research on this stuff. I think if we wanted to approach it scientifically, we could, and we could develop principles. And I think there are people like the Ehrenberg Bass Institute in Australia who have done a good job on this. There are people like Professor Karen Nelson Field who have done good work in this. There are people like Les Binet and Peter Field in the UK who have done good work on these issues, but nobody seems to want to agree on what they have found. And the same controversies that I find when I entered the field 100 years ago we're still arguing about them. What role does creative play versus strategy? All the fundamental questions of advertising and to some degree marketing still remain largely controversial. Don't believe everything you hear. Evolve your own ideas about how advertising works. Watch real people react to advertising and see how they react to it. And from that, you will learn much more than talking to old people like me who have fixed ideas.
And that's a wrap on this episode of Melt. You can follow us on social media. Our handle is Ready to Melt. And stay updated with all that's happening in the world of advertising and marketing with our daily Melt update on our website, readytomelt.com. I shall see you next week, same time, same place. Goodbye.